In the shadowed corridors of the Medici Palace, where power shifted like sand beneath the feet of princes, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a truth that would echo through centuries: the greatest fortress a man can build is not made of stone and mortar, but of complete detachment from the weaknesses that make him vulnerable. This document explores the profound philosophy that emerges when one learns to sever the chains of emotional dependency, social validation, and material attachment, unlocking a form of power so pure and unassailable that no external force can touch it. The concept of detachment as power runs counter to every instinct modern society has cultivated within us. We are taught to connect, to feel, to attach ourselves to outcomes, people, and possessions as measures of our worth. Yet Machiavelli, through his observations of successful rulers and the fallen alike, understood that these very attachments become the levers by which others manipulate us, the vulnerabilities through which we can be destroyed. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that clings, that fears, that depends, becomes something far more formidable, a force of nature that moves through the world untouchable and unbreakable. This transformation is not about becoming cold or unfeeling. It is about achieving a state of such complete self-mastery that external circumstances hold no power over one's inner state or decision-making process. When a man learns to operate from this place of ultimate detachment, he discovers that paradoxically, he becomes more effective in every area of life. His judgment remains unclouded by emotion, his actions are guided by pure strategic thinking, and his opponents find no weakness to exploit because he has already eliminated every point of vulnerability within himself. The journey toward this state begins with understanding the nature of weakness itself. Weakness is not the absence of strength, it is the presence of dependencies that can be leveraged against us. Every attachment we form, every need we develop, every fear we harbor becomes a potential weapon in the hands of those who would seek to control or defeat us. The weak man is the man who cannot bear to lose, who needs approval, who fears judgment, who depends on external circumstances for his sense of self-worth. This man, no matter how physically strong or intellectually gifted, remains forever vulnerable because his enemies need only threaten what he values most to bring him to his knees. Consider the merchant prince who built his fortune through careful calculation and ruthless efficiency, only to watch it crumble when his competitors discovered his one weakness, his desperate need for social acceptance among the nobility. They did not need to outcompete him in business, they simply needed to threaten his social standing, and he made increasingly poor decisions trying to protect his reputation. His attachment to status became the instrument of his downfall. Had he been truly detached from the opinions of others, he would have continued making optimal business decisions regardless of social pressure, and his empire would have remained intact. The path to destroying one's weak self requires a systematic examination and elimination of every dependency that gives others power over us. This process begins with emotional attachments. The man who loves someone so deeply that he cannot bear to lose them has handed his enemies a loaded weapon. This does not mean becoming incapable of love, but rather loving from a place of choice rather than need. True strength in relationships comes from the ability to walk away at any moment without losing one's sense of self or direction. When someone knows you cannot leave, they hold all the power in the relationship. When they know you can leave easily but choose to stay, the power dynamic shifts entirely. Material attachments follow the same principle. The person who has grown accustomed to luxury and comfort becomes enslaved to maintaining that lifestyle. They make compromises, accept degrading treatment, and sacrifice their principles to protect their material position. Meanwhile, the person who can live equally well in a palace or a hovel possesses a freedom that makes them dangerous to those who would control them. They cannot be bought because they need nothing, they cannot be threatened with loss because they are attached to nothing. Professional and social attachments operate similarly. The individual whose identity is wrapped up in their career title, their social status, or their reputation within a particular group has created multiple pressure points that others can exploit. When threatened with professional ruin or social ostracism, they will often betray their own interests and principles. The detached person, whose sense of self exists independently of these external labels, remains unaffected by such threats and can therefore act with complete freedom. The cultivation of this detachment requires daily practice in releasing attachment to outcomes. Every decision, every effort, every interaction must be approached with complete commitment in the moment while maintaining absolute indifference to the results. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the transformation because it requires operating at full capacity while simultaneously accepting that failure is not only possible but irrelevant to one's sense of self-worth. In the realm of interpersonal relationships, detachment manifests as emotional independence. The detached person enters every interaction from a position of completeness rather than need. They do not seek validation, approval, or emotional support from others because they have cultivated these resources within themselves. This independence makes them magnetic because people are naturally drawn to those who possess what they themselves lack. Paradoxically, by needing nothing from others, the detached person often receives more genuine connection and respect than those who desperately seek it. Professional situations reveal the power of detachment most clearly. The employee who desperately needs their job will accept any treatment and make any compromise to keep it. Their desperation is visible to their employers and colleagues, making them easy to manipulate and dismiss. The person who approaches their work with complete professionalism while maintaining the inner knowledge that they could walk away at any moment operates from a position of strength. They negotiate better terms, command more respect, and, ironically, enjoy greater job security because their value is clear while their desperation is absent. In negotiations and conflicts, detachment becomes the ultimate advantage. The party who needs the deal the most invariably gets the worst terms. The person who can walk away from any negotiation without emotional distress holds all the real power, regardless of their official position or resources. Their opponents cannot use pressure tactics or emotional manipulation because there are no emotional buttons to push. They cannot threaten loss because the detached person has already accepted loss as a possibility and organized their life accordingly. The process of achieving this level of detachment often requires confronting and dissolving the ego structures that have been built up over a lifetime. The ego creates identity through attachment to roles, relationships, possessions, achievements, and beliefs. Each of these attachments becomes a potential source of suffering and manipulation. The dissolution of these ego structures is not a process of becoming less, but of becoming more authentic, more powerful, more free. This transformation often involves a period of apparent loss and isolation. As one begins to detach from the various external sources of validation and identity, there can be a feeling of emptiness or disorientation. This is natural and temporary. What feels like loss is actually the clearing away of false supports to reveal the solid foundation of autonomous selfhood that exists beneath. Like a building being renovated, the structure may seem unstable while the old supports are removed, but this is necessary to install the new framework that will prove far more durable. The detached person develops what might be called strategic empathy, the ability to understand and work with human emotions without being controlled by them. They can comfort others without taking on their pain, inspire others without needing their admiration, and lead others without depending on their approval. This emotional independence makes them more effective in every social context because their actions are guided by clear thinking rather than emotional reactivity. In the face of criticism or attack, detachment provides invulnerability. The person who is attached to their reputation, their image, or others' opinions suffers genuine damage when these are attacked. Their energy goes into defending rather than creating, reacting rather than acting. The detached person recognizes criticism as information that may or may not be useful, but never as a threat to their essential self. They can therefore respond strategically rather than defensively, often turning attacks into advantages. The cultivation of detachment also involves developing comfort with uncertainty and change. The attached person seeks security through control, controlling outcomes, other people's behaviors, and future circumstances. This creates constant stress because control is largely an illusion. The detached person finds security in their ability to adapt to any circumstance rather than in controlling circumstances themselves. This makes them incredibly resilient because they are prepared for anything while attached to nothing. Financial detachment deserves special attention in this context. Money, like any other form of external resource, can become either a tool of freedom or a chain of bondage depending on one's relationship to it. The person who has organized their life around maintaining a particular income level or lifestyle has created a vulnerability that others can exploit. Fear of financial loss causes people to accept situations they would otherwise reject and to compromise values they would otherwise defend. True financial detachment does not mean being careless with money or living in poverty, but rather maintaining the ability to lose everything without losing oneself. This requires developing skills that cannot be taken away, cultivating resourcefulness that functions regardless of circumstances, and organizing one's life in such a way that happiness and self-worth are independent of material conditions. The person who has achieved this level of financial detachment paradoxically often becomes more financially successful because they can take calculated risks, negotiate from strength, and make decisions based on long-term strategy rather than short-term fear. The detached approach to goals and ambitions represents another crucial element of this philosophy. While the attached person's happiness depends on achieving specific outcomes, the detached person finds fulfillment in the process itself. They set goals not as destinations they must reach to be complete, but as directions that give structure to their efforts. This allows them to pursue objectives with complete intensity while remaining unaffected by failure or unexpected changes in circumstance. This approach to goal setting creates a remarkable psychological advantage. Because their sense of self-worth is not invested in any particular outcome, the detached person can pursue multiple strategies simultaneously, abandon approaches that are not working without emotional investment in being right, and adapt their methods as circumstances change. They waste no energy on regret, self-recrimination, or attachment to plans that are no longer viable. The practice of detachment in daily life requires constant vigilance and conscious choice. Every interaction presents opportunities to either strengthen or weaken one's attachments. The compliment that inflates the ego, the criticism that creates defensive reactions, the setback that generates self-pity, all of these are tests of one's level of detachment. The goal is to receive all external input with equanimity, extracting whatever useful information it contains while allowing the emotional charge to pass through without taking hold. Physical health and mental clarity both improve under this approach. The stress that comes from attachment to outcomes, fear of loss, and need for validation creates chronic tension in both body and mind. When these sources of stress are eliminated through detachment, energy that was previously wasted on worry and emotional reactivity becomes available for productive use. Decision-making becomes clearer because it is no longer clouded by fear, desire, or the need to protect various attachments. The detached person develops what could be called strategic patience, the ability to wait indefinitely for the right opportunity without becoming anxious or desperate. This patience is not passive but rather the confidence that comes from knowing one can thrive under any circumstances. It allows for long-term thinking and planning because short-term discomfort or uncertainty does not create pressure to make premature decisions. In competitive situations, detachment provides numerous advantages. Competitors often defeat themselves by becoming emotionally invested in the outcome, making decisions based on pride, fear, or anger rather than strategic thinking. The detached competitor remains calm under pressure, adapts strategies based on changing conditions rather than emotional reactions, and cannot be manipulated through psychological tactics because they have no emotional buttons for opponents to push. Leadership becomes more effective when exercised from a position of detachment. Leaders who need to be liked, feared, or respected have given their followers the power to manipulate them through the granting or withholding of these emotional rewards. The detached leader operates from a place of service to the objective rather than service to their own emotional needs. This creates authentic authority because their actions are consistent with their principles rather than their psychological dependencies. The phenomenon of failing up becomes more understandable through the lens of detachment. People who seem to advance despite apparent failures often possess a high degree of detachment that allows them to learn from setbacks without being defined by them, to maintain confidence despite criticism, and to continue pursuing objectives without being paralyzed by the fear of future failure. Their detachment makes them resilient and adaptable, qualities that often prove more valuable than initial competence. Romantic relationships, perhaps more than any other area of life, reveal the power dynamics created by attachment and detachment. The partner who needs the relationship to validate their worth, provide their happiness, or complete their identity has handed control to the other person. They will tolerate poor treatment, make excessive compromises, and lose themselves in the attempt to maintain the relationship. Meanwhile, the partner who loves freely but does not need the relationship for their sense of completion maintains their power and, paradoxically, often inspires deeper love and respect. This dynamic extends to all forms of social relationship. Friendships, family relationships, and professional associations all function more healthily when approached from a position of detachment. This does not mean being uncaring or aloof, but rather caring from a position of choice and strength rather than need and weakness. The detached person can be fully present in relationships without losing themselves in them. The concept of reputation requires special consideration in developing detachment. In many cultures and professions, reputation seems crucial for success. However, attachment to reputation creates vulnerability to anyone willing to attack it. The person who cannot bear to have their reputation damaged will often make poor decisions to protect their image, sometimes creating the very damage they sought to avoid. True strength comes from building a life so solid and self-contained that reputation becomes irrelevant. When one's happiness, success, and sense of self-worth are independent of others' opinions, attacks on reputation lose their power. This does not mean being careless about one's actions or their consequences, but rather acting from internal principles rather than external validation. The detached person often discovers that as they stop caring about their reputation, it naturally improves. People respect authenticity and strength, both of which emerge more clearly when the desperate need for approval is removed. Actions taken from genuine principle rather than image management tend to be more consistent, more effective, and more admirable. In dealing with difficult people and situations, detachment provides emotional armor that makes one nearly invulnerable to manipulation. Difficult people typically operate by creating emotional reactions in others: anger, fear, guilt, or sympathy, and then leveraging these emotions to get what they want. The person who responds to every provocation with calm strategic thinking rather than emotional reactivity cannot be manipulated in this way. This emotional invulnerability is not the same as being unfeeling or uncaring. Rather, it is the ability to feel emotions without being controlled by them, to understand others' emotional states without taking them on, and to respond to situations based on clear thinking rather than emotional impulses. This often makes the detached person more effective at helping others because their assistance comes from strength rather than codependency. The practice of detachment extends to intellectual attachments as well. Beliefs, opinions, and worldviews can become sources of ego identity that make one defensive and close-minded. The intellectually detached person holds their beliefs lightly, always ready to modify them based on new evidence or better reasoning. This intellectual humility is actually a form of strength because it allows for continuous learning and adaptation. Political and ideological attachments often create the most irrational behavior in otherwise intelligent people. When one's identity becomes wrapped up in a particular political party, ideology, or cause, criticism of that position feels like a personal attack. The detached person can evaluate ideas on their merits without the distortion of ego investment, making them more effective advocates for worthwhile causes because their arguments are based on reason rather than emotional attachment. The relationship between detachment and courage deserves exploration. Many people confuse attachment with caring and assume that detachment leads to cowardice or indifference. In reality, the opposite is often true. The person who is attached to safety, comfort, or approval is constrained by these attachments and cannot act courageously when courage conflicts with these needs. The detached person, having nothing to protect and nothing to lose, can act with complete courage when the situation demands it. This courage is not reckless because it is guided by clear thinking rather than emotional compulsion. The detached person does not seek danger for its own sake but does not avoid necessary action because of fear. They can speak truth to power because they do not need power's approval, stand up to injustice because they do not fear the consequences, and take necessary risks because they are not attached to the security they might lose. In crisis situations, the advantage of detachment becomes most apparent. While others are paralyzed by fear of loss or overwhelmed by emotional reactions, the detached person can assess situations clearly and act decisively. They do not waste energy on panic, denial, or wishful thinking but focus immediately on what can be done given the actual circumstances. The ability to function effectively under pressure makes the detached person invaluable in leadership roles during difficult times. Others naturally look to the person who remains calm and clear thinking when everyone else is losing their composure. This leadership often emerges naturally rather than being sought because the detached person's focus is on solving problems rather than gaining position. Sleep, health, and peace of mind all improve dramatically as detachment deepens. The anxiety that comes from attachment to outcomes, the anger that comes from attachment to how things should be, and the depression that comes from attachment to what has been lost. All of these sources of suffering diminish as one learns to accept what is while working skillfully with present circumstances. This does not create apathy or resignation but, rather, a form of engaged acceptance that allows for maximum effectiveness. Energy that was previously consumed by emotional resistance to reality becomes available for creative problem-solving and purposeful action. The detached person often accomplishes more than others precisely because they waste no energy fighting against circumstances they cannot control. The social benefits of detachment can be counterintuitive. People are naturally drawn to those who do not need them because such individuals represent the freedom that others unconsciously seek. The person who desperately needs social connection often repels others with their neediness, while the person who is complete in themselves attracts genuine connection. This principle applies to all forms of social interaction, from casual friendships to professional networking. In business and entrepreneurship, detachment from outcomes allows for better decision-making and risk assessment. The entrepreneur who cannot bear to lose their investment will often throw good money after bad, refuse to pivot when their initial plan is not working, and make emotional rather than strategic decisions. The detached entrepreneur can cut losses quickly, adapt to market feedback, and make rational decisions even when they involve admitting previous mistakes. The paradox of detachment is that it often leads to greater success in conventional terms, even though success is not the primary goal. When one is not attached to being wealthy, actions are more likely to create wealth because they are based on value creation rather than desperate money grabbing. When one is not attached to being loved, behaviors are more likely to inspire love because they come from authenticity rather than neediness. This paradox extends to all areas of life. The person who is not attached to being healthy often becomes healthier because their dietary and exercise choices are based on what actually serves their body rather than what serves their image or emotional needs. The person who is not attached to being intelligent often becomes more intelligent because they can admit ignorance and learn from anyone rather than protecting their ego through defensive intellectualization. Professional advancement often accelerates when approached with detachment. The employee who is not desperately attached to promotion can focus on excellence for its own sake, take on challenging assignments without fear of failure, and speak honestly in situations where others remain silent to protect their advancement prospects. These behaviors naturally lead to recognition and advancement, but because advancement is not the primary motivation, it comes without the stress and compromise that usually accompany career ambition. The cultivation of detachment as a practice requires treating every situation as training. Each moment of anger reveals an attachment to how things should be different. Each moment of anxiety reveals an attachment to a particular outcome. Each moment of sadness reveals an attachment to something that has been lost. Rather than judging these emotional reactions as failures, they can be used as information about where attachments still exist and need to be dissolved. This process is gradual and requires patience with oneself. Complete detachment is not achieved overnight, and expecting instant transformation is itself a form of attachment to outcome that creates suffering. The goal is progress rather than perfection, with each step toward greater freedom being valuable in itself rather than merely a means to some future state of completion. Daily meditation and contemplation support this process by creating space between stimulus and response. In that space, one can choose whether to react from attachment or respond from detachment. The practices of observation, acceptance, and letting go become habits that eventually function automatically, creating a stable foundation of inner freedom that no external circumstance can disturb. The study of historical figures who demonstrated this principle provides both inspiration and practical instruction. Consider leaders who remained calm under extreme pressure, innovators who persisted despite repeated failures, or individuals who maintained their integrity despite enormous pressure to compromise. In each case, their effectiveness came not from being unfeeling, but from being unattached to the very things that would have paralyzed others with fear or desire. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journals that would become the Meditations, demonstrated this principle repeatedly. Faced with plagues, wars, and personal tragedies, he maintained his effectiveness as emperor precisely because he had cultivated detachment from outcomes while remaining fully committed to his duties. His writings reveal a man who could lose everything: health, loved ones, empire, without losing himself. The businessman who can walk away from any deal negotiates the best deals. The leader who does not need to be followed attracts the most loyal followers. The friend who does not need approval gives the most valuable advice. The lover who does not need to possess inspires the deepest love. In each case, the absence of need creates the conditions for receiving what others desperately seek but cannot obtain through seeking. This principle applies equally to creative endeavors. The artist who is attached to critical acclaim often produces work that panders to expected tastes rather than expressing authentic vision. The writer who needs to be published may compromise their voice to meet market demands. Meanwhile, the creator who works from pure inspiration, detached from reception, often produces the most powerful and original work precisely because it comes from an uncompromised source. The final stage of this transformation involves what might be called transparent effectiveness, the ability to move through the world accomplishing objectives without creating disturbance or resistance. Because the detached person is not driven by ego needs, their actions do not trigger defensive reactions in others. They can influence situations without appearing to do so, lead without dominating, and create change without creating enemies. This transparent effectiveness comes from operating in harmony with natural principles rather than fighting against them. Like water that finds its way around obstacles rather than trying to break through them, the detached person accomplishes more with less effort because their actions are aligned with the fundamental nature of reality rather than with egoic desires. The ultimate power of detachment lies not in what it allows one to do to others, but in what it prevents others from doing to oneself. When every attachment has been dissolved, every dependency eliminated, and every fear conquered, one becomes truly invulnerable. Not because one is protected by external armor, but because there is no weak point for external forces to exploit. This invulnerability is not a fortress that walls one off from life, but a flowing strength that can engage fully with life while remaining unbroken by it. The detached person can love without possessiveness, strive without desperation, lead without domination, and serve without self-sacrifice. They become like the eye of a hurricane, completely calm while tremendous power moves around them, participating in the dance of life while remaining untouched by its chaos. The man who destroys his weak self through the cultivation of complete detachment discovers that what he thought was destruction was actually revelation. Beneath all the false structures of ego, attachment, and dependency lies an indestructible core of being that needs nothing, fears nothing, and can lose nothing because it never possessed anything in the first place. This is the true self that no external force can touch, the source of authentic power that no circumstance can diminish. From this place of complete detachment, one operates not from weakness disguised as strength, but from strength so fundamental that it requires no display. Actions flow from principle rather than reaction. Decisions emerge from clarity rather than confusion, and relationships form from choice rather than need. The power that emerges from this state is not power over others, but power over oneself, and ultimate self-mastery proves to be the foundation of all other forms of effectiveness. In the end, the philosophy of detachment reveals its deepest truth, that freedom and power are not things to be gained, but things to be uncovered by removing everything that obscures them. The weak self that must be destroyed is not actually part of one's essential nature but rather an artificial construction of fears, desires, and dependencies that have accumulated over time. Destroying this false self does not diminish one's humanity but reveals it in its pure form, unencumbered, unafraid, and ultimately undefeatable by any external force. This is the Machiavellian insight at its most profound, that the prince who would be unconquerable must first conquer himself, not through force but through the complete abandonment of everything that makes conquest possible. When there is nothing left to attack, one becomes invulnerable. When there is nothing left to defend, one becomes free. And, when there is nothing left to lose, one becomes capable of anything. The path of detachment is thus not a path of diminishment but of infinite expansion, the expansion that comes when all limitations born of fear and attachment are finally released, revealing the boundless strength that was always present beneath them. The man who walks this path discovers that in losing everything that he thought made him strong, he has found the only strength that can never be taken away, the strength of being completely, authentically, and invulnerably himself.